Hello, and a very warm welcome to the very first episode of the Money Side Up podcast. This is the show for Australians all over the world, back home in Australia and in various countries across the globe, to cover all things personal finance. We're talking all things money, from investment planning to tax to the exciting topic of budgeting, investing in property, whatever it might be. For Australians, we've got it covered. A huge thank you for joining us today. As I said, the very first episode of Money Side Up. Today, we're going to introduce ourselves, tell you a bit about why we started the podcast, who it's for, who we hope to help, and why you should tune in and listen. My name is Jarrad Brown, Senior Financial Planner here in Singapore, having been here for a little over a decade now and hopefully many more years to come. And joining me today is Joel Kerin, Senior Financial Advisor down in Perth. Thanks, Joel.
Hello, hello.
Wonderful to have you with us and looking forward to this exciting journey together. Now, before we get into it, of course, we need to keep our legal team happy. So let's just cover off our standard disclaimer. Everything you hear on this podcast and all podcasts to come will be purely for your entertainment and hopefully information purposes only. Hopefully you learn a bit about it, but none of it is personal advice. So don't go out and act on anything that we talk about. Seek personal advice, seek professional advice from your licensed advisor or from your tax agent. So enough about the disclaimer. Let's move on and tell you a bit about us and our journey. So Joel, I'll throw over to you. Tell everyone a bit about yourself, your background, how you've come to be here today.
Sure, thanks, Jarrad. So I have worked in financial advice directly and indirectly for the past 11 years and have been a personal financial advisor for the past 7 years. So I've held roles with life insurance providers and life insurance advisory businesses, private bank and boutique financial planning firms before joining Ally Wealth at the end of 2020. For those who don't know, Ally Wealth was started in 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic saw a lot of movement and change in the expat community, with normal work and living demographics getting quite that aggressive shake-up, which caused a lot of people to review their situations, plans and goals for a post-lockdown world. And I joined Ally at that time as a new challenge to help guide expats in whatever direction was their new normal. So during the past 11 years, I suppose I have worked with mum and dad families in building on their wealth and structuring, I suppose, financial independence all the way up to ultra high net worth family office clients with wealth design, intergenerational planning and philanthropy. But these days, it sort of largely looks the same, but with the added flavour that my clients are majority Australian expats living and working all over the world. Whilst this sometimes does mean late calls or early Zoom meetings, I do get to travel quite a bit, largely to Singapore and throughout Asia. And I get to hear a lot of benefits and challenges that face the expat community and aim to provide tailored advice and to maximise that expat experience, all the way from departing Australia and then eventually repatriating and touching back home, if that is so what happens for that client. But I suppose enough about me. Jarrad, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Thank you very much, Joel. And it's funny you mentioned the new normal and how, COVID impacted all of us as expats. I was literally having a conversation with a client yesterday talking about permanent residency versus employment passes and work visas in Singapore, and how the two don't really differ a great deal. And then we kind of reflected back around how Singapore was basically rejecting anyone on an employment pass from re-entering Singapore during COVID. So it feels like a bit of a lifetime ago now. And thankfully, personally, my wife and I weren't impacted to any major extent, which was lovely, and we're extremely grateful. But I think had that been a different story, we may very well be permanent residents now, or who knows what would have happened had that gone differently. But yes, look, a little bit about myself. So I started as a financial planner in Perth, good old Perth, working with largely executives in the resources sector or services too. Perth, lovely place, family is there, but what it kind of came time for a change. And so decided to move to Singapore about 11 years ago. It was basically a time to say, look, let's go and live and work abroad for a period of time, see how it goes, see how we enjoy it. Very quickly found that there was a huge gap in the market for specialist Australian expat advice. Now, you could probably argue the same about every nationality, that everyone needs a specialist for them. But the reality is Australians are far more likely to either or both have assets back in Australia. So usually we'll have property and superannuation. And B, we will usually go back and work and or retire in Australia at some point as well. It's one of those fabulous countries where if you open the door, everybody wants to come in. And the same is true for expats. So more and more people going abroad now to build up their wealth, to go through that international career. But Australia is eventually always going to be that long-term home. So for me, I certainly hope to be offshore for the next decade. It's been a fabulous journey so far. We've met some incredible Aussies all over the world now. We're working with Australians in about 36 countries. So as you say, early meetings, late meetings, weekend meetings, we've done them all. And we're actually running a seminar here in Singapore later this evening. So it definitely keeps the work really interesting. And there's just so much to cover and so much more fascinating than just working with your everyday Australian clients. So I guess enough about us. Let's talk about why we've started this podcast, what sort of motivated us, and I guess the name behind the podcast as well. Money Side Up. Would love to tell you there's some creative story or some weird link that, sunny side up eggs or you calling someone sunny side up means they're a bit more optimistic about life. And that's why we've called it Money Side Up. Not really anything that creative. We just really like the name. And it's really about bringing money, personal finance to the surface. Joel, anything you'd like to add on the name of our podcast?
Oh, look, only that, ChatGPT has become a bit of a sensation, particularly in the last 12 months. And when we were trying to name it, I'm pretty sure we were talking about, let's try and find a pun of some persuasion. And we were all frantically typing into ChatGPT funny podcast puns. So I suppose this is where we ended up. So he's hoping it's as sticky as a good egg.
Absolutely. I think that's a good way to put it. So I'm sure there'll be many more puns on the name as we go through this podcast journey. But yeah, there you have it. Nothing too amazing or insightful, but isn't ChatGPT wonderful? But really, in terms of why we started this podcast, I mean, gosh, I've been here in Singapore for nearly 11 years now. As you heard, Joel's been in the financial services industry for many years. We know there is so much noise, so much good information, bad information, and everything in between. And it just gets so much more convoluted, particularly when you're working offshore. All of a sudden, you're marketed to from buying villas in Thailand to a ski resort in Switzerland to some weird little business in Indonesia and everything in between. And it gets harder and harder to work out what's actually sensible, what we should be doing with money, how do we protect the family, the kids, insure ourselves, and everything in between. So our hope with this podcast is really that as we release each podcast on a different topic, we're simplifying different ideas, we're I guess, debunking some of the myths and commonly held beliefs out there as we go through, hearing from more and more experts as we go through the podcast as well. Different people sharing their stories, people in financial services or connected to that we trust to do a good job. They've either worked with us personally or they work with our clients. So you'll certainly hear from them as we go through the journey. But again, Joel, I guess anything to add as far as sort of your motivation for being part of the podcast as we go through?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, there's been, in many ways, there's lots of financial experts that we're seeing in podcasts, in TikTok, in social media. But sometimes we try and see that there's limited expertise in that expat space, particularly. So it's just really important to really try and channel what is important for Aussie expats wherever they decide to live around the world, and try and debunk a lot of a lot of myths when it comes to, you know, what happens if I'm in a different country per se, but I'm not a citizen of this country. Does that have any broader impacts on my personal situation? And just try and strip it back down to, I suppose, bare bones and say, well, this is going to be the outcome. And try and benefit and educate expats around the world that how to best utilize their time whilst they're working abroad.
Fantastic. I think that sums that up very nicely. We're sure many more people are going to become Australian expats every year. The world is getting more and more connected. The ability to work, even for an Australian employer or run an Australian business from a different country, is getting that much more palatable and that much more possible. And I guess on that note, just talking about time-sensitive information, one of the big topics that we cover regularly with our clients and certainly discuss, explore, is, of course, tax rates. And this is really designed to be just an introduction to the podcast. But given that only earlier today we saw our Prime Minister come out with a bit of a backflip, I guess, to the original intended tax cuts that were planned to come into effect from 1 July 2024, was basically going to mean that anyone earning less than 200,000 or 45 to 200,000 was going to get a nice little healthy bump in terms of tax saved each year. But Joel, as we saw, I guess a bit of a change to those plans potentially.
Yeah, so like naturally, I think the logic of the Labor government has come out and said that, you know, they want to have policy and tax policy that sort of benefits everyone. And that's sort of quite reflective of today's news. We're seeing, you know, a slight increase in the tax-free threshold from 18,200 to about $19,000. Now, it's obviously important to note that this is not currently legislated. So this, you know, is just, I suppose, Labor's intended design of the stage 3 tax cuts, and this could be subject to change even still. But yeah, reducing the current 19% tax rate down to 16% so that, you know, even people earning up to $45,000 a year, again, targeting that very lower to middle income earners, are getting a very, you know, a tax saving as well. And then again, still keeping the 37% tax bracket, but increasing when that kicks in, and essentially trimming off some of the tax savings that would have been felt if you were earning, say, in excess of 200,000, and sort of sharing that amongst everyone a little bit. So now we've seen plenty of news already coming out that, you know, if the Liberal government gets re-elected, then they're going to backflip on this and go back to their original plan. But, you know, that's obviously a ploy to secure some votes. But I suppose time will tell. It's a bit hard coming from it's a bit hard coming from someone who's sitting in Singapore and probably paying top marginal tax of 24%.
Well, there is, of course, that, and of course, why we hope this podcast will be very popular to many, even those sitting in Australia who might be thinking, gee, I wonder what it takes to go and live and work somewhere else. Maybe that's these changes to the proposed tax cuts are just the kick that they need to start packing the bags and going to work somewhere else. But yes, as you say, time will tell in terms of these tax cuts exactly what they look like. But it does highlight just how quickly things can change. And gosh, just the importance of really planning ahead as much as you possibly can. So look, let us tell you a bit about the structure of this podcast. What to do, what will be happening going forward. As we said today, this introductory podcast or introductory chat is really just to give you a sense of who we are, the who's who in the zoo, bit of an idea of what we'll be covering, why we set up Money Side Up as the podcast, why we think it's going to be of value. But we will be releasing a new podcast each and every month. We'll be interviewing a different expert each month as well. So all things from ETF product providers through to expat accountants, tax advisors, even property consultants. There will be plenty we'll be covering throughout the year, all designed to educate, inspire, inform Aussies all over the world, and of course, demystify the world of personal finance. So it'll be released on the last Wednesday of each month is the current plan, obviously barring any public holidays, wherever they may fall. But that will be our commitment to you to get this podcast out each and every month. Hopefully something you really enjoy, can share. Obviously would love if we're adding value, give us 5 stars. We're never going to be selling you anything on this podcast, and that will always remain true. So hopefully you just get a lot of value out of it. You'll find it on all major podcast services. So whether you're jogging around Marina Bay in Singapore and want something entertaining and informative to listen to, or you're down in cold, freezing Melbourne, looking for a nice warm coffee, you'll be able to tune into the podcast wherever you may be. So, as we said, hopefully you'll get a lot of value, a lot of information out of this. It will be available. So, yeah, please do tune in, share it. If this does sound like something you're interested in, then of course check us out on all the socials. Money Side Up or at Money Side Up, you will find us. You'll be able to subscribe to the podcast, stay tuned with the updates, and of course, hear more from Joel, myself, and the rest of our team as we go through. So next month's podcast, we will be interviewing a tax expert. So entering the new year, given the tax cuts and the proposed changes that we've just heard about, we thought that would be rather timely in terms of what you need to be planning for. So stay tuned for that one. We'll be talking a bit about the proposed tax residency changes, what it means to both exit Australia and, of course, return to Australia as well. So a huge thank you for tuning in to our very first podcast. As we said, hope you get a lot of value out of it, but really appreciate you giving up your time. And hopefully we have the chance to share some value and inform you along the way. But huge thank you very much for tuning in.